Hello. Okay, we're live. Yes, it's good to see so many people logged in for this event. Welcome to the session live. This is a podcast where we dig into the politics and policy of the Montana State House. I actually am sitting in the basement of the Capitol right now, which is where we have been recording our podcast all session. But now you get to see us and our live reactions to what went down this session. I'm Shaylee Rager. I cover government and politics for Montana Public Radio. And tonight we want to break down the major issues that happened at this year's legislative session and answer your questions about them. That's really our goal. You'll be hearing from MTPR and Montana Free Press reporters over the next hour and a half on what they covered this session. 4 months of lawmaking, political infighting, lots of that, bipartisan alliances, and from tax policy and education to healthcare and Indian country, we've got lots to talk about tonight. So before we get started, let me just give you a little agenda of how this is going to go tonight. We'll be tackling a couple of issues at a time in short segments with the reporters who covered those issues. And then we'll take about 5 minutes for questions from our audience after each of those short segments. And then at the very end of this hour and a half, well, it'll likely be more, but at the end of the hour, we will start taking questions from the audience more broadly about the session and what you want to know about. So please send your questions into that Q&A box below as we go. We want to hear from you. We want to know what your thoughts and feelings and questions are. So yeah, keep them coming as we continue to go. I think we're gonna start with Tom Ludy and Eric Dietrich. They will be our first segment today. It's been exactly 1 week since the 69th legislature adjourned. Oh, hey, Mara, you can stick around. Okay, we'll come back to Mara in a minute. Yeah, if I could have Eric and Tom, please introduce yourselves. Oh, Tom, I think you're talking, but you are muted.
Yeah, I'm Tom Ludy with Montana Free Press. At the legislature, I cover judiciary and chaos,
And I'm Eric Dietrich,
partisan
also.
bickering.
I'm Eric. I'm also with Montana Free Press. I've been focused on dollar money stuff this session, so taxes, especially property taxes, state budget, also a little bit of housing this year.
And there happens to be so much overlap between money and chaos during the legislative session. So,
as it turns out, yeah.
Yes. So I think we'll just dive right in. From the onset of the session, one of the biggest priorities was property tax relief. We know this is top of mind for a lot of Montanans as they think about their tax bill coming down this year. So, Eric, what happened on the property tax front?
The short version is that the governor's second home tax proposal passed. It was a little bit dicey there for a second. It was unclear what was going to happen. It was voted down and back up multiple times. But stepping back from the legislative drama, the folks that were trying to push that through got it through. It's a complex piece of legislation. A lot of moving pieces there. The proponents' hope is that it will reduce taxes substantially on owner-occupied homes and long-term rentals, while raising it on homes that are second homes or Airbnb style short-term rentals. The actual full implementation actually will take an extra year. They got it through too late in the session to implement it for the tax bills that come out this fall. There are a few things that need to happen there in the middle. So in the interim, there are going to be some interim rates that will probably reduce taxes on folks some, and then also another round of rebates, the flooding $400 rebates for homeowners, so not for renters again. And then those rebates, the challenging thing will be that the Department of Revenue is going to have to figure out what homes are and aren't second homes, and they'll use the rebate application process as kind of a pre-registration for that.
Sure. Yeah. For Montanans who remember that registration application, it will be similar, right? Well, I guess we'll wait and see.
Similar.
But
they are saying they're hoping to make it easier. They heard the concerns that were coming from certain corners on that and are trying to respond to it.
Again, we will wait and see. But Tom, I want to turn to you because we saw some really interesting political coalitions form behind property tax and budget issues. Talk to us about what those looked like.
Well, I mean, we saw moderate Republicans in the Senate and the House coalesce with Democrats to form simple majorities in order to advance, big ticket items. And the phrase that was that was sort of tossed around quite a bit was 51, 26, and 1. In other words, really simple majorities in the Senate or in the House and the Senate, plus the signature of the governor. And that really is kind of the coalition that they built. And that isn't that's a little more bipartisan than what you might expect. And a lot of that heavy lifting as a result of that partnership really comes from Democrats. So both in the House, we're in the end we're in the end less than half the Republican caucus supported the property tax package, and especially in the Senate, where that 18-member Democratic minority with very few defectors delivered more votes to the nine moderate Republicans necessary to pass property taxes, Medicaid expansion, family tax credits for children and child care. Things went pretty smoothly for that group in the House. And I think probably because the Republican Speaker and the Republican Majority Leader were both part of that coalition. And they had people chairing committees who were also part of that coalition. On the Senate side, not so much, right? Because leadership was opposed, and as a result, you saw a ruckus, right? You saw a ruckus. You saw several bills blasted to the floor out of committee where this coalition really had little control. So they bring them to the floor and take care of them as they saw fit.
Right, right. And I guess too, to your point about needing that governor's signature, I think it's worth noting that that coalition, that working majority, as they called themselves, was often very aligned with the governor's priorities, and that gives some sway too. That helps kind of move those bills through the process. Eric, talk to me about how they ultimately got that property tax package across the finish line.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, it was a complicated process. The initial implementation bill, it was kind of this is the bill the governor's back, sponsored by Representative Lou Jones from Conrad, who had developed the proposals of the governor's property tax task force. That advanced through the House with a little effort. They had to tailor it to pick up some Democratic votes and House approach to get it through, but passed through the House with kind of relatively little drama. Got to the Senate and stalled, was voted down as Senate tax, was I think blasted out of Senate tax. And the procedural details were so complex that it just kind of becomes a thicket for the trees. And by the end, Senate leadership, including the chair, Senate tax, including the Senate president, they were opposed to that bill and that package. They had other ideas they preferred. So it became a lot messier and ended up kind of splitting along those split lines in the Senate, politically speaking.
It seems like we saw similar lines and coalitions on the budget as well. Would you say that's true?
We did, yeah. I mean, anytime we're talking about this, right, it's a little bit of a broad brush, and like particular bill, like a few votes here and there, maybe somebody didn't like something or kind of buck the coalition a little bit, right? So things shift around some. It's not, yeah, it's not always, or at least it wasn't always ironed in like that. But yeah, this year the state budget passed this year with Republican and Democratic votes, both in a kind of in a contrast to 2 years ago when the budget passed with Republican votes. It was much more of a party lines thing that year. A couple of reasons for that. One, the Democratic caucus was bigger this year. There were more Democratic votes that gave them more negotiating leverage. And as a result, we ended up with a dynamic that looked a little bit more like the days when we had a Democratic governor in the governor's office, where the hardline Republicans were often complaining that the moderates had abandoned them to go work with Democrats instead.
So we saw Republicans split on the budget, on property tax policy. I guess we should note too, Republicans did coalesce around an income tax cut this session. That has been a priority for Governor Greg Gianforte since he took office. That was again something they pushed through this session.
Yeah, that's the exception, right? So like big policy, I think more than $250 million a year in reduced state revenues once it's finally fully implemented in a couple of years, and that ended up coming together on party lines essentially. I think with maybe like one or two exceptions, but so if it's not like there's a Democratic governor, right? There still is a Republican in the governor's office, and in some issues we're seeing that kind of bipartisan coalition, and in other issues we're seeing different coalitions. That's kind of the nature of politics.
Okay, so we're going to start taking some questions from some of our audience members. And we have a question that I'm going to add on to a little bit too for you, Eric. We have someone who wants to know if the legislature passed anything to provide relief for renters. And I wonder if you can speak to that and then just broadly if there were other housing bills that the legislature was able to pass this session.
Yeah, so the renter relief question is tricky to answer because it comes down to like the theory of change you believe in with housing. If you're somebody who believes that fundamentally the issue with the housing market is that there's not enough housing to go around, it's a supply issue, and that the right solution to housing is to build more housing, make it easier and cheaper to build, and then let the market take care of rents. The legislature did pass some things. There's some more infrastructure money to help support housing developments. There were also some more zoning reform bills, reform and air quotes was different, that looks differently to different people. Bills passed that kind of make it harder for local governments to restrict new construction. The big one I think is probably parking requirements. There's a bill en route to the governor that would, if signed, limit how much parking cities can require with new construction. You talk to people that are trying to build like duplexes, triplexes, or bigger housing, especially in existing urban areas. They'll often tell you that those rules are the constraints for them. Anyway, so pro market stuff, yes. If you're somebody who believes that meaningful housing is more money for capital A subsidized affordable housing, or laws that kind of basically like rent control or something like that, no. And so Republican controlled legislature, they weren't as interested in those ideas. They did pass one notable bill. It was a renters rights bill, and that requires that property managers refund security deposit, or not security deposits, refund application fees if they're not used for things like background checks to people who aren't successful in getting the apartment. I think there's concern in some corners that those application fees have kind of become a profit center for some property managers instead of like a transaction thing to kind of help cover costs.
Yeah,
So
it was interesting, Eric. I kind of want to follow up on that in that it was interesting to talk or listen to the debate over structural train structural change to the property tax system and how that might not have direct money back into the pockets of renters, but a lot of our Republicans argued that landlords should pass any relief they have onto their renters.
well, it was yeah, it was a little bit more than that, right? It wasn't a should, right? It was a the market will force them to was
Right.
when we were pushing, you and I and other folks were in press conferences asking those questions, right? What we heard is, yeah, I don't expect them to do it out of the goodness of their hearts, but I think the market forces will. So again, do you believe housing is a market thing, or do you believe that it needs other sorts of government intervention? The
Right.
philosophical question there.
Right. Yeah. Another one where it's like, we'll wait and see. That's more reporting we will do down the line as these rates go into effect over 2 years time, over a period of time. So sometimes it takes a while to see the actual impacts. So I'm curious, Eric, to be a little specific on this property tax stuff. We have a question about what specific results might we see for homeowners who are able to apply for that homestead exemption.
Yeah, so tricky question because and the proponents of the package are promising you will see lower tax bills, or most people will see lower tax bills this year. Not if you're a second homeowner or an Airbnb operator. You probably the homestead piece, which means the second home tax, right? Different way of phrasing it. That won't be implemented until next year. So you won't the tax bills you get this year won't factor that in. The next round of tax bills will. Um, Beyond that, most people in modest homes should, if the math that the proponents were looking at is correct, end up seeing property tax reductions. It's actually tricky to say that because, like, one of the things that's challenging about property taxes is that there are 56 counties and a couple hundred school districts and a couple hundred municipalities, and all tax bills are unique within all of those jurisdictions and then how they overlap with each other. And so the math gets really complex and locally specific. It depends on like what the composition of your tax base is. And now I'm just droning on. So it's complicated. Write your lawmaker if you don't see the decrease they seem to have promised you.
Yeah, no, I'm glad we have you looking at those numbers, Eric, because they are complicated and you're right, so locally specific. Again, it's something you should talk to your local officials about if you want to get a better idea. We are going to move on to our next section for now. We are going to have Tom back later, and then at the end of this hour, we will have more time for questions for Eric as well. I'm going to say bye to you both for now. But thanks so much for your time. We are going to move on to a section about environmental regulation and education policy. So we have Ellis Julin joining us, Amanda Eggert, and Alex Sackerson. And they have all been covering these issues. They're experts in their field. I am kind of a general government beat reporter. These people are really experts in what they look at. So yeah, please introduce yourselves.
Yeah, thanks, Shaylee. Hi, everybody. I'm Ellis. I'm Montana Public Radio's environmental reporter.
I'm Amanda Eggert. I cover the environment for Montana Free Press.
And I'm Alex. I cover education and childcare issues for Montana Free Press.
Okay, I'm going to start with what was breaking news when we were going into the legislative session, or big news, which was that we got a Supreme Court decision in the Held v. Montana climate case. That was that case with youth plaintiffs who sued the state over inaction over climate change. Amanda, remind us what happened in that lawsuit and how lawmakers viewed it and their role in responding to it.
Right. So in December, we got a ruling from the Montana Supreme Court siding with the plaintiffs, saying that the state needs to analyze climate impacts of large projects like a coal mine or a power plant. And then it kind of turned it over to the legislature to figure out what that analysis should look like. So we got bills that were introduced by both Republican and Democratic lawmakers, and the ones that advanced out of the legislature came from Republican lawmakers. I'm going to talk, there is a whole suite of changes to the Montana Environmental Policy Act that came out of that ruling, but I'm just briefly going to talk about 3 of those bills. One of them mandates that the Department of Environmental Quality analyze some of the most common greenhouse gases, but it explicitly directs agencies of the state not to regulate them. Another revises the Montana Environmental Policy Act, or MEPA, in more general ways and makes it harder to challenge major projects in court, along with doing all sorts of other changes to this law that was initially passed in 1970. And then there's a third saying that the state cannot regulate air quality emissions for gases unless the federal government also regulates them under the Clean Air Act. So that's unlikely in the near term with Donald Trump in the White House. And all 3 of those bills I just mentioned have been signed into law by Governor Gianforte.
I'm curious. So obviously, there were some groups that were really cheering on the Held decision. They were happy to see the Supreme Court rule in favor of Held. What was their reaction to these bills?
Among the environmental community, I think there's been a lot of disappointment in terms of what the legislature came up with and passed. And there is also been some hypothesizing that there will be further lawsuits developed kind of challenging these laws and whether or not they protect the constitutional guarantee to a clean and healthful environment, which Montana Supreme Court justices said also includes the right to a stable climate system.
Okay, we got to jump to another hotly contested topic in the legislature, which is wildlife management, and has long been a contentious topic. Ellis, I have heard you coin the phrase before, say that there are big feelings about wildlife management at the legislature, in state government. Republican lawmakers were eager to pass laws aimed at reducing the state's wolf population. Where did they land on that?
Yeah, that's right, Shaylee. And sometimes I think the bigger the animal, the bigger the feelings. So that certainly holds true with wolves and grizzly bears. But like you mentioned, we saw lawmakers in 2021 pass a suite of bills aimed at reducing the statewide wolf population. That was changing a lot of hunting and trapping regulations to kind of get to that goal. And we're back in 2025 some hardline Republicans have said the state hasn't done enough to cut down on wolf numbers since those 2021 changes. So at the beginning of the session, we saw 2 bills that directed the state, the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, to manage wolves to kind of a minimum number. And that was, in essence, looking to cut the population in half. Both of those ultimately failed to get enough votes to make it to the governor's desk, but we did see one bill that would allow the use of infrared scopes or thermal imagery scopes in wolf hunting pass out of the legislature this session. And then the other big kind of conversation, also a little bit of a drawing on things that we saw in the 2023 session, which was the debate over marijuana tax revenue. Right now, it's about $60 million a year that's brought in, and that money's allocated to a variety of different things. Last session, there were some lawmakers interested in moving it away from habitat conservation, which is a big part of that pot. That happened again this session and failed. So ultimately, that marijuana tax revenue money is going to stay in habitat conservation, non-game wildlife funding, trail maintenance, things like that. But there's 2 competing bills. One came out of the House and one came out of the Senate that will keep that money where it is, and then also set up a special account for wildlife crossings. We saw strong bipartisan support for both of those bills. So now they're both headed to the governor's desk, and it'll be up to him which one he signs. And then the last kind of thing that goes hand in hand with that wildlife crossings account is another bill that passed that creates a state account to fund the construction of these crossings. So think overpasses, underpasses, wildlife friendly fencing to help animals safely cross our interstate systems. And that will primarily be funded by a new wildlife crossings license plate. So stay tuned for that if you're interested in it.
Yeah, I want to know what it's going to look like, but I guess
I know, I do too.
Right, we'll have to wait and see. We are going to switch gears, kind of a hard turn here, to education and childcare, although maybe just as unruly as wildlife. But Alex, you have been following these issues closely for a long time. We've seen some funding shortfalls for school districts across the state. How did lawmakers look to address those this session?
Yeah, I'll stick to the big top line, which was the STARS Act. I'm sure everyone's heard of it at this point, but to recap quickly, that was a really strong bipartisan effort to address primarily the teacher shortage that school districts around the state have been struggling with. And the primary goal of that bill was to inject $100 million in additional state funding to increase starting teacher pay. That was an amount that was flagged in the budget that Governor Greg Gianforte handed to the legislature at the beginning of the session, had his backing, and it is currently on his desk waiting for a signature. So that's going to increase starting teacher pay. There are some other sort of details that I don't think have gotten quite as much attention in it, but one of the big ones is also providing additional state funding tied to student outcomes. And what that's really focused on is dual enrollment or dual credit and career tech ed opportunities, really shifting a lot of state funding or sending a lot of state funding to districts where students are really, capitalizing on those opportunities. That's going to be a bit delayed because there's a lot of questions around the data collection needs on that front and kind of how to make sure the districts are getting the money that's associated with those students in the right way. But that's eventually going to be kind of a big lift, and all kind of ties into some of the levy votes that we've seen just happened this week. So, yeah.
Right. There really is that interplay between local government, state government, school districts. It's not all just one sweeping change. It's a
we had one example. The Kalispell School District last fall negotiated raises for their teaching staff in line with what they anticipated the STARS Act would allow for. So really kind of a leap of faith on their part that this legislation was going to get passed and signed into law. And they just had their first high school operating levy in 18 years approved by voters. And so really there's a lot of acknowledgement, even among local district level voters, that the funding picture in public education right now in Montana is kind of dire, and there just needs to be a lot more support. And lot more funding for our classrooms.
And then briefly before we jump into questions, Alex, I wonder if you can talk to us about what lawmakers did on the child care front. We know there is a lack of available and affordable child care in Montana. How are policymakers thinking about that?
Yeah, really, one of the big takeaways was just the widespread acknowledgement of childcare being a significant challenge for working families in the state of Montana. And one of the accessibility options that the legislature wound up passing is a bill that will automatically make childcare workers eligible for a state subsidy program called the Best Beginnings Scholarship, so that their kiddos can get childcare, and they don't have to worry as much about covering those costs or having their employers in the childcare industry comp them that service. Then we've also got the megatrust bill that passed, and a portion of that, $10 million, is flagged to set up a trust fund that will ultimately fund local efforts to improve childcare access and affordability. So a lot happened there too.
Yeah, no, lots. I mean, this is a big, complicated policy that all of you are speaking about. So I do so appreciate you breaking it down for us in these big, broad strokes. And we're going to get into some listener questions. I want to remind people that we will be taking questions after each of these sections. We have sections on healthcare and Indigenous issues and the judiciary coming up. And so keep sending them in. We want to hear what you want to hear from us, and we want to answer more questions at the end of this. We just love questions. That's what journalists are known for. So I want to start with a question for Amanda and Ellis, and see what you both think of this. What a question from the audience. What did the legislature do for water quality issues and land use during the legislative session?
I'll tackle the water quality piece. So the big ticket item there is that the legislature took another run at repealing numeric standards for nutrients. So that's nitrogen and phosphorus. They passed the legislation in 2021 trying to repeal numeric standards, which are numbers, in a favor of narrative standards, things like color, smell, undesirable aquatic life. The EPA rejected that and said that doesn't comply with the Clean Water Act. Take another try at it, state. And so the state tried to draft some rules that would comply with federal regulations and was unsuccessful. So lawmakers basically tried what they did in 2021 again this session, saying we don't want numeric standards anymore, and kind of throwing that ball back into the EPA's court.
Right. Okay. And Ellis, talk to us about land use. Public lands are huge for Montanans. How did lawmakers think about that?
Yeah, public lands have often been referred to as a third rail in Montana politics. It's kind of the thing that you don't go up against, or when attempts are made to privatize public lands or to transfer control of federally owned public lands to the state level. We've seen those proposals fail during this session. So for people who aren't familiar, the state of Utah has been working to try and gain control of federal public lands. The Supreme Court refused to hear Utah's case, but they're trying to submit it again through lower courts. And there was a resolution in Montana's legislature that would support Utah's endeavor, kind of a vocal support. It doesn't actually do anything in terms of the litigation itself, but we saw that fail on pretty large margins on the House floor. And then we also saw legislation that would have authorized DNRC, Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, to start looking at developing homes on state trust land. And that also was struck down through the process. So we're continuing to see that kind of strong bipartisan support for public lands. And it's not related to what you asked, Shaylee, but I'll just answer a quick question in the chat because I think it'll only take me a second. The governor has not signed the community solar shares bill yet. I'm probably getting that name wrong, but someone asked about that. It has not been signed yet. It's one of the ones I'm watching for. So I can just answer that really quickly.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. We do have another, bill signings are happening every day, all the time now. So we're really trying to keep track of what the governor is signing and vetoing. And he did veto a bill yesterday that would have phased out styrofoam. Just any reactions from Amanda or Ellis on this, and whether there's a path forward for a regulation like this in the future, or if this is just something the government does not have an appetite for?
Yeah, this was another bill where we saw kind of interesting bedfellows with bipartisan support on phasing out styrofoam containers. I think it was 2028 that would have had restaurants start phasing out the use of styrofoam for to-go containers and things like that. I think it was Monday that the governor vetoed it in a social media video where he drank out of a cup that said a styrofoam cup that said veto on it. If you've seen that, and I think that we saw a lot of support from lawmakers to try and address this. Obviously, styrofoam sloughs off bits of microplastics, which is a concern for a variety of human health reasons. And the governor ultimately vetoed it, saying that it was too restrictive on Montana businesses and kind of a form of government overreach. So that bill is essentially over and done with. And as we know from covering a few sessions now, nothing's ever truly over. So maybe 2027 styrofoam will be back on the ticket. Who knows?
I will say, I remember a version of that wildlife passage bill that died last session, right? Came back past this session. So it's one of those things you never know when they're going to refine it, bring it back. Who's to say? We do have to move on now to our next session, but these lovely people will be around to ask questions at the very end. So thank you again all for taking the time to break down all this policy for us. I want to take just a moment to say that this event is possible thanks to Montana Public Radio, Montana Free Press, and Yellowstone Public Radio. And if you value this reporting, we are nonprofit news organizations, and we work hard to do this every week. If you value this and the legislative coverage that we've done and the podcast, please visit our sites and donate if possible. And I think you will see some links in the chat at some point to do that. But we so appreciate you tuning in. It's really fun to know that people are engaged with the reporting that we're doing. As you can see, we all love to nerd out about this stuff. And so I'm going to bring in now Mara Silvers, Aaron Bolton, and Nora Mabey to talk about some health policy and Indigenous priorities during the legislative session. So I'll have the three of you introduce yourselves, please.
Hey, thanks, Shayla. Yep, I'm Mara Silvers. I cover health and human services for Montana Free Press. And Nora clearly did not get the memo about the black t-shirts that Aaron and I decided to wear to our group
Nora
event.
and I are in green, okay? Nora and I are on the same page.
I'm Aaron Bolton. I cover healthcare broadly for Montana Public Radio.
I'm Nora Mabey, and I cover tribal affairs for Montana Free Press.
Okay, great. So let's dive into something that it's funny to think back towards the beginning of the session, which feels like a lifetime ago, but was really just January. Going into the session, a marquee issue that we knew was going to be a big debate was Medicaid expansion and whether the legislature wanted to renew it. Mara, remind us, what was the question lawmakers needed to answer here, and how did that debate go?
Yeah, so essentially lawmakers were deciding whether or not to continue providing this public health coverage, healthcare access to low-income adults between the ages of 18 and 65. The legislature first decided to do that with a bipartisan block of votes in 2015. They renewed it in 2019, and it was up for renewal again. So the bill that they ultimately passed lifts that sunset, that kind of recurrent sunset, and so Medicaid expansion is not expected to come up again for another debate in future sessions in the same way. It could come back and be debated in other ways. But ultimately, this has always been a bipartisan policy in Montana. But I think that it's worth saying that even though it was the Chamber of Commerce's number one issue, it's supported by the Montana Hospital Association, the Montana Healthcare Association. I mean, every major group that you could think of is basically saying that Medicaid expansion helps their clients or helps their bottom line in some way or another. But there are a really steady block of Republican lawmakers who don't like the policy, and they put up a lot of passionate opposition, a lot of proposals for other ways to deal with Medicaid expansion or to phase it out completely. And ultimately, they just didn't get any purchase. I think it's worth noting that, honestly, the landscape of the legislature was arguably shaped in expectation of the Medicaid debate by some of those major groups that even got involved in Republican primaries way back 18 months ago and started supporting candidates that they thought might support Medicaid expansion. And interestingly, when everybody got elected in the Republican primaries, I was texting sources and they were saying the House seems like it's a pretty solid makeup for Medicaid expansion, but they weren't so sure about the Senate. And then, of course, the Senate dynamics played out in a way that block of 9 Republicans were constantly voting with Democrats, and Medicaid became basically a guarantee.
Right. My first session was 2019, the last time Medicaid expansion was up for renewal, and it was a hotly debated issue that took the entire session to hash out. And the governor signed this in what, March, February? I shouldn't say because I'm not positive, but
yeah, end of March. Yeah, it feels like a long time ago.
Right, absolutely. And I think something else that's interesting is that not only did lawmakers agree to expand Medicaid expansion this session, they had a healthy budget, they have money. They also decided to put a boost in reimbursement rates for Medicaid providers in the state budget. So it seems like lawmakers were more willing this session than maybe they have been in the past to dedicate more money and more of their budget to these government-funded programs for healthcare, and there are other ways that they have been dedicating money to behavioral healthcare, to other types of healthcare. So, Aaron, remind us about this big pot of money that we saw pass last session. How lawmakers have been trying to leverage that for other programs and other areas that we're spending money on healthcare.
Yeah, you might remember back in 2023, the legislature allocated $300 million under what has been known as the 872 to form this commission that has this long name, but most people just refer to it as the 872 commission. And they came up with a bunch of recommendations that went before the legislature this year. There were 10 in all. Lawmakers.
I'm so sorry. I think you might have. There's a little bit of feedback. I'm wondering if you have 2 tabs open. There's a little bit of okay. There's a little bit of feedback.
Let's hang on. Let me change something real fast.
Yes.
Is that any better?
Let's see.
Is that better?
Yes, that's better. Okay, there we go.
All right. Just can't use the microphone. I'll start over real quickly. In 2023, lawmakers allocated $300 million for behavioral and mental health reform. A committee put 10 recommendations that were forwarded on by the governor before lawmakers this year. Lawmakers approved most of them, allocating about $40 million, nearly $40 million in initial seed money. That'll get those initiatives rolling. And they include things like community-based services for case managers, higher reimbursement rates for inpatient psychiatric services, more staffing to help people transfer from the state psychiatric hospital back to the community. Those are just some of the highlights, but many of these efforts will rely on enhanced federal funding that comes along with Medicaid expansion. And the governor put these in his budget and is relying heavily on expansion to make them work in the long term.
Right. Well, and another big piece of the picture for Montana when we're talking about behavioral health care that the state can provide is the Montana State Hospital, which has, been in the news for years now for really having some big challenges it's trying to overcome. Mara, could you talk us through maybe briefly what were some of the big bills or efforts that lawmakers made this session to address the Montana State Hospital?
Yeah, we saw lawmakers do, I guess, two versions of support for the Montana State Hospital in Warm Springs. They passed a budget that included more funding for the state health department to continue hiring traveling staff, hiring contract staff, and hiring consultants. It's kind of a big pot of money that is just generally called like an operations budget that the state health department can use to continue trying to fill their staffing needs because staffing has been such a difficult issue. But then also on the patient side of things, lawmakers approved funding in a couple of different vehicles for more beds at the state hospital and more beds at other facilities that are that like higher level of need type of setting, while also like all the things that Aaron just talked about, trying to find other ways to treat people at the community level and keep people at the community level if they can be kept there. But there was for a while a bill that was proceeding that would have explicitly opened a behavioral health facility, a mental health facility for people involved with the criminal justice system somewhere in eastern Montana. That bill it stalled out at some point, but the language for that funding of that type of facility made it into the general infrastructure budget bill, House Bill 5, which hasn't been signed yet. So it's possible that the governor could line item veto some of those things or move pots of money around. But these are all things that most of these things have been things that his health department have acknowledged struggling with in recent years.
That's a good reminder, Mara, that while a lot of this stuff is passed, we are waiting for the governor to sign or veto. He can do the same thing in the budget. He can line item veto pieces of the budget that he doesn't want in there. So it's still not a done deal, but these are things that passed out of the legislature and that we're keeping an eye on. I want to bring in Nora now. Montana's American Indian Caucus is an informal group of Native American lawmakers. I think it's one of the largest American Indian caucuses in the country. And they have priorities that they work on through the session that they say is good for Indian country and by extension, good for Montana. Nora, how did the caucus do this year?
Yeah, this year, Montana's American Indian Caucus saw historic success. So they had a bunch of their priority bills go through the legislature, which a lot of the members attribute to Republican Party infighting in the Senate. One of the biggest pieces of legislation we saw go through was a bill that establishes Indigenous Peoples Day in the state. And that one was really interesting to see because similar legislation has been proposed for 10 years and it's really not made significant progress. So this year it passed out of the House and the Senate, and now it's on the governor's desk. Another big deal for the caucus was extending the Montana Indian Child Welfare Act. And that's basically a state protection that includes Native families and tribes in child foster care and adoption situations. And so that was extended, which was a big deal for the caucus. And then there were several bills that aimed to address the missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis. There were two pieces of legislation that aimed to bolster the state task force on that, dedicated to that issue. There were two bills aimed at human trafficking prevention and education efforts. And then there was one resolution that advanced both chambers that basically calls on Congress to increase funding for law enforcement in Indian country. And then lastly, the state's budget bill, House Bill 2, includes two big investments for Indian country, or newer investments, I should say. One is dedicated to repatriation efforts at University of Montana. And then another is increasing funding to tribal colleges. And I should mention that all the bills I just talked about have passed both the House and Senate, but have not been signed by the governor yet.
Right. Okay. So more to keep an eye out for. We are going to get into audience questions now. And I have one that I think, Aaron, you already kind of touched on and alluded to, but we are seeing a new federal administration. What happens for Montana if the federal government decides to cut Medicaid funding?
Yeah, so Montana is one of several states in the country that has kind of what's referred to as a trigger provision in its Medicaid expansion law. And what that allows for is lawmakers could essentially do nothing and Medicaid expansion would sunset, but they also have the ability to come back and decide whether they want to make up this gap. And so Medicaid expansion reimbursement rates do vary depending on services, but they are generally higher than your standard Medicaid, a lot of times around 90%. And so if federal lawmakers decide to lower that, state lawmakers would have to have a discussion about whether they were going to essentially make up that gap, what they would want to do, how much of that gap they would want to make up, if there were cuts they would want to make along the way. So that would be a discussion lawmakers would likely have to have in order to save that program, depending on what the federal government does. And that is triggered even if the reimbursement rate goes down just a little bit. So if it goes down at all, that trigger provision will be enacted and lawmakers will have to talk about it.
And Mara, am I right? That could mean special session.
Absolutely. It could mean a special session. There was some appetite among lawmakers to really talk about those hypotheticals during the session, but ultimately they are just hypotheticals, and lawmakers decided to pass the program, continue with the program that they already have. But it was on the minds of many, many lawmakers, including many of the Republican conservatives who were voting against Medicaid expansion, because they were saying, look, the federal government could change this any day, and Montana is not going to be able to afford this alone. If the rate change, like what Aaron is talking about, it could mean hundreds of millions of dollars that Montana would have to make up the total at a minimum. So it is pretty uncertain. I will say that I asked the sponsor of the Medicaid expansion bill, Representative Ed Vetri out of Great Falls, if he had had conversations with the congressional delegation about those federal budget decisions. And he said that he had been talking to them. This was soon after Gianforte signed Medicaid expansion. But he said that he didn't think that if the federal budget does change, he doesn't think that it will be a light switch. It might be something that happens gradually over time. And he also said that he didn't think that it would be a decision that Montana's delegation would make lightly, because he said they wouldn't want to be responsible for taking away people's health care. Whether or not that ends up being the way that politics shake out in Washington remains to be seen.
So much remains to be seen, but we're here. We're ready to keep covering it. One last question from our audience. Was there any legislation that passed that to increase the number of elder care or retirement facilities for elderly, low-income Montanans?
You know, this was not as big of a focus as it was last session, when a lot of nursing homes and facilities that care for seniors had closed or were struggling. This session, there were some things that were, I guess, like nibbling around the edges, unless I'm missing something major, which is possible. But that 3% provider rate increase that Aaron referenced earlier, or maybe Shaylee, you referenced, it applies to those same facilities. And so while there wasn't anything that I saw that was about opening new facilities, there was at least a bit of an acknowledgement that those providers might still need to continue to see rate increases to keep their services going.
Got it. Okay. Well, again, we will circle back to these reporters. We are going to keep Mara Silvers here, and we're going to bring back Tom Ludi for our next discussion. We are going to be talking about gender and abortion bills and bills targeting the judiciary and looking to restrict the judiciary. And so these are both big topics of discussion that are much more policy based, kind of outside of the budget discussions. But there are still some budget implications for sure. But these are definitely policy heavy bills. Mara, there were many bills this session related to societal gender norms, legal definitions of gender and sex, protections or lack thereof for non-binary, transgender, and intersex Montanans. There was a big variety of bills. So remind us, what did we see?
Yeah, for a couple of weeks there, it was kind of like every week was a new example of the ways that lawmakers were looking at how this issue plays out in different parts of society: schools, education policy, medical records protections for minors from their own parents. Let's see, what were some other big ones? Child welfare system, athletics and sports, gender transition related treatments in medicine, and medical malpractice law changes for providers that provide those treatments. So it really spanned the gamut, and I think it shows how much this issue has become a cornerstone of the national and the state GOP in trying to reflect their preferred worldview and I think an opposition to general progressive politics around gender fluidity and gender diversity. So essentially, at the outset, I thought that most of these bills were going to pass because they would be messaging bills and they would be really clear kind of demarcations of a test of who is a true conservative. So we saw some of those bills pass early on, like the bathroom bill and a bill about trans participation in sports. But then, interestingly, some of those bills started to either fail or be amended down to be kind of unrecognizable versions of what they started as. And it seemed like a lot of Republicans, especially in the House, seemed to stop believing the credibility that these bills were going to do something that was seriously important for the people of Montana. And ultimately, at that point in the session, they hadn't really started to tackle property taxes yet. And you heard a lot of Republican lawmakers off the record and on the record saying, why are we focusing on these things when we could be focusing on property taxes? So some of those big bills, like creating a felony for parents that support their child's gender transition, those died. And it was interesting to see kind of the test of how many, at least like how the volume of bills that lawmakers were willing to entertain.
We also saw a mixed bag of success for bills on abortion. You and I have been covering abortion for a few sessions now, and it felt different this session, probably because Montana passed a constitutional amendment last November to enshrine access to abortion in the Constitution. But what did we see on that front, Mara?
Yeah, very interesting. I think this was a huge test season for CI 128 and really the support or lack thereof for abortion restrictions in law. There were a couple of abortion restrictions that were really interesting. They were trying to work around CI 128. They might have adapted model legislation from other states, and both of those bills, they kind of, there were some that were introduced in the Senate, some that were introduced in the House, and they all failed at different points in each chamber. So they never crossed over to the other chamber, which was interesting to see. And that included Republican lawmakers saying, this bill goes too far, or I don't think that we should be messing with this issue in this specific way, which was fascinating. But there were also some other bills that seemed to be more of the safe votes for Republican lawmakers to take, such as a constitutional initiative that would have defined personhood as beginning at the moment of conception. And in that case, that passed on party lines through both chambers, but it didn't meet the 2/3 majority threshold. And I think Republican lawmakers were very aware that they could safely vote for that bill without actually sending it to the voters right after they passed CI 128 and having their voters say, hold on, why is this new constitutional initiative in front of us?
Right, right. Tom, let's talk about the judiciary, because we saw lawmakers spend a lot of time last interim studying the judiciary. I should say Republican lawmakers on a special select committee spent a lot of time looking at this. It was a top priority for hardline conservatives who say the courts are biased against GOP policies, and they want to see some more oversight of the courts. They said that they are trying to create more transparency, and one of the ways they wanted to do that was by making judicial elections partisan, saying that would give voters more information about who judges are. There was a lot of pushback against that, saying, that could create a lot of problems in the judicial system, that it should be impartial to the utmost degree. How did the judiciary agenda shake out this session?
Well, I think it was a lot like Medicaid expansion. I mean, I think most of us, in the press, I mean, at the very outset of the legislature, assumed that this was going to be, one of the big, issues that sort of drove the conversation, and that from beginning to end, we'd be, covering this stuff in hearings, and we'd see a lot of it going out the door at the other end. And it fizzled. I mean, it really did fizzle. I mean, there was an expectation that limiting the power of the courts was going to be a legislative priority. Like you said, Gene Forte prioritized requiring judicial candidates to declare a political party, as did Republican leaders in the legislature. And, lawmakers put in the work, right? There was a select committee formed by Senate Republicans. They spent 8 months in 2024 on hearings that ultimately resulted in 27 bills, plus a few extras that came in along the way, maybe to sort of make an attempt at partisan judicial races after those initial bills failed. But Democrats assigned to that committee, that select Senate Republican Committee on Judicial Reform, didn't attend. Right? They didn't attend, and I think that kind of set the table for a lot of what we saw in the legislature as well, where as these bills coursed through, the House and Senate Judiciary committees, particularly in the Senate, what was being passed, very easily out of committee, where there was a real distinct advantage for Republicans. Once they got to the Senate floor, that voting bloc, 9 Republicans and 18 Senate Democrats had different thoughts. Right. So, I think we saw it a little bit different there. I also think, and I pointed this out during the session, that there is not a Republican attorney in the Senate right now. And I think that was significant. Right. I think that was significant. You can have legislative staff at your committee advising you, but that's not the same thing as having someone who can sort of speak with authority from the position of just simply being another lawmaker. And so we saw that. We also saw that on Senate Judiciary. There were two Democrats on the Senate Judiciary who were attorneys. There were no attorneys on the Republican side, and so I think that kind of influenced how things worked out as well. But of those 27 bills, all but 6 of those bills failed, right? And lobbyists for Montana State Bar Association and Montana trial lawyers raised questions about the constitutionality of what was being proposed, particularly separations of powers, between branches of government, right? And I mean, where does that start? Well, it starts at who gets to decide what's constitutional, right? So we have Marbury versus Madison. We had a bill empowering the legislature to decide if its laws are constitutional, as opposed to the Supreme Court deciding if their laws are constitutional. That bill failed. We had a bill targeting the Office of Disciplinary Counsel for an audit. ODC had prosecuted Attorney General Asa Knudsen for alleged official misconduct while defending legislators way back in 2021. We're still waiting for a ruling from the Supreme Court on that one. We had one to relocate the Judicial Standards Commission to the Attorney General's office, sort of trying to, maybe remove a little bit of that position of power for the judiciary. And I think that, all of that was sort of log rolled together in an effort that, didn't really pan out the way that they expected. And in fact, Montana's new Supreme Court Justice Corey Swanson cautioned legislatures, to leave the courts alone. And I know, from talking to the Speaker of the House about that very thing, they bristled at that. They didn't really appreciate Corey Swanson, cautioning them on, sort of how to approach the judicial branch. But the partisan judicial races failed. I mean, in part because lawmakers disagreed about which races should be partisan. Some just wanted state Supreme Court to be partisan on the ballot. Others wanted party affiliation in every judicial race, right down to the municipal level. And we started to see splits on that, just within the Republican Party. And in fact, that top to bottom partisan judicial race bill that did so well in the Senate, died in the House for lack of solid Republican support. So there were things that passed, right? So public performance reviews of judges passed, and you're going to see that. I think you'll see it in campaign ads. That information is public, and I'm sure that's going to wind up in an ad near you between now and next year. Political parties can now donate directly to candidates. That's significant because candidates get a reduced ad rate, a significantly lower ad rate than PACs do in races. And so that's going to stretch the dollar quite a bit in those races. So we now have 2 candidates declared for state Supreme Court, the position being vacated by Justice Beth Baker. That race is on the ballot next year, and I don't think we're going to have to wait very long to see how campaigns are affected.
We have an audience question for you, and I think I'm going to tack a little bit onto this as well. But the group of 9 Republicans who we saw vote with Democrats on some key issues, do you see that as a sign of bipartisanship working its way back into the process, or is it maybe just kind of a one-off, just kind of a happenstance? And I guess I would also love for you to speak to the Republican infighting we saw and contextualize that for us in general in terms of, we've seen the Republican Party split before.
Well, that's true. I mean, I think that, well, for starters, and I think Eric touched on this a little bit too when we were, talking about, tax issues at the beginning of the podcast. This isn't the first time that we've seen moderates coalesce, right? I mean, we all remember the Solutions Caucus. That was a bipartisan effort, so we've seen that before. There's, I mean, at the end of the day, if there are votes at play in the House and the Senate, uh, you know, compromise more often than not is going to win the day. I mean, if the numbers are there, and you can get your voters to stick together, you're going to have success, right? And I don't think that's a one-off thing. I think that that will continue. And as Katie Sullivan pointed out at the end of the session, Minority Leader Katie Sullivan in the House, there are 12 more Democrats in the legislature now than there were prior to 2024 when we saw newly drawn legislative districts in Montana. So that certainly makes a difference. Just kind of ensure numbers, and also I think they picked up some people within the Democratic caucus who were a little more willing to coalesce with the Republicans.
Right. We should note that it's not just Republicans who split. There are certainly factions in the Democratic Party who are more willing to reach across the aisle as well, and that was certainly a factor.
But to your point, I mean, when we talk about sort of what that looks like, I mean, I think that we saw that. I mean, particularly in the Senate, right? I mean, when we were, I think it was Senator Fuller, who suggested who called the Monday after Easter Resurrection Day, right? Because so many bills that had been presumed dead were rising up, coming back to life. And I think he could have probably said the same thing on the Friday and the Thursday before Easter as well. It was more like Resurrection Week. But I mean, as sardonic as that is, I mean, there were several days, throughout the session when the hardline Republican members of the Freedom Caucus, which are sort of the kind of the majority of that Senate Republican caucus, were expressing outrage over their lack of control. So we saw a lot of anger. We saw people even cry at times. It was very emotional. And then, at times it was just really, kind of interesting. I mean, if you think about, how many times we saw the chairman of Senate Finance, in claims, Carl Glim, talk about the fact that he really, had lost control about the bills that were coming through his committee. And I think he was the original person who coined the phrase, the cake is baked. We saw on the second to last day of the legislature, cupcakes appeared on Senate desks that said baked in, and a little commemorative cupcake for everybody. So I thought we saw a little bit of that. Mara and I,
I was going to say, I will never forget. Yeah, I will never forget in all of my days watching Senator Teresa Manzella we were up in the gallery watching Senator Teresa Manzella on one very late night theatrical floor session get an order of pizza and open the box and intentionally go around and offer pizza, not to her seatmates and not to the people who were closest to her, but only to the Republicans who were voting with the Republican majority. And every member of the 9 that was seated in that chamber just happened to miss out. And it was those types of petty and overt slights that really did make the Senate spicy to watch any day that you happen to be there. I think that it does seem, whereas some other examples of the Republican caucus splintering in prior sessions was maybe a little bit more behind the scenes, this just spilled out in the open. And I think that stung a lot of people, and it was fun probably for the other people who are perpetrating some of that chaos. And we'll see more of that going forward into Republican primaries down the line, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think we could keep talking about the as Tom coined the phrase, hot buttered shenanigans in the Senate. We could keep talking about that for a while, but I'm going to bring back the rest of the reporters to continue our Q&A. We want to take questions from our audience. Those who are with us, thank you so much for listening. And we want to kind of get back to some of these questions. Amanda, we have a question for you. What happened with the bills on exempt wells? How did that end up?
The short answer is that it fell pretty flat on its face. There is a big effort to overhaul wells that are exempted from the normal water rights permitting process that was developed over the course of 1 to 2 years. And it revised all kinds of groundwater administration, and it also closed 5 basins around the state to groundwater development for residential development. I should say exempt well development for residential development. And it didn't make it through its first chamber. It failed pretty spectacularly in the Senate after garnering a whole bunch of opposition from a whole bunch of very different interest groups, from agricultural folks to development folks to environmental folks. It was the kind of compromise legislation that just didn't really seem to make anyone happy.
I want to ask a question we didn't get to earlier for Alex. Well, we have another question too that just came in on education. But when you were talking about the STARS Act, I wanted to ask, we did see the Teach Act last session. Lawmakers have been trying to address school funding for a while and teacher pay. How does this session compare, broadly speaking, to the past few sessions we've seen?
Yeah. So one of the STARS Act was actually kind of initially described as the Teach Act on steroids. They quickly moved away from that because it just took on a whole life of its own. But it did kind of build on a lot of the momentum that had been established in the 2021 and 2023 sessions. I've had several sources who have been active in public education issues and have helped write policy and push policy since like the early 90s. And they're saying that when it comes to education funding in particular, this was probably the most significant legislative session in their experience. Similar to how the 2023 session was a huge session on education policy and passing a lot of changes to, kind of the instruction side of things. And so I think the last 2 sessions, education has really emerged as a big issue, but funding was the name of the game this time around. Not that they didn't pass a bunch of other stuff, but.
Was there anything specific, Alex, for rural schools to support them?
Yeah, to some degree, it springs to mind some of the bills tackling state support for various different aspects of education funding. So they wound up resurrecting and passing a bill that is going to increase the amount of state funding that goes towards school infrastructure. And a lot of the smaller districts around the state have considerable deferred maintenance. They've got old buildings, they've got root balls in their pipes, they've got leaky roofs that are leaking into server rooms and into classrooms. And I mean, you hear this a lot from school officials. And so that's one example, really kind of increasing that state investment and taking a lot of that burden off of local taxpayers. And there are a couple other bills too that are going to, in one way or another, try to either redistribute or drive down the pressure that non-voted local levies for things like teacher retirement or transportation, which obviously transportation is going to be a big issue in rural districts. And so I think some of those issues will really move some dials for rural districts in interesting ways. So that's one thing that springs to mind.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. We have another question to Eric, again on policies that might help renters. Is there anything else you can think of that people should be aware of that might impact their rents? Anything off the top of your head?
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see how the property tax relief bill intersects with rents. Like I mentioned before, like landlords will benefit from that if they apply, get the homestead exemption from their long-term rental properties. But I guess I think I might have hit on this earlier, but it's going to be interesting to see like whether that feels like direct benefit to renters, whether that does help slow the increase in rental prices, or eventually you maybe even bring prices down or help bring prices down.
Something
I think
else
I
I
just
wonder if
repeated
you will
myself.
agree with me, Eric. Yeah, no, I'm wondering if you agree with me on this, that I think there are several policies that um, lawmakers will talk about that say, maybe this doesn't directly impact the thing we're talking about. But for instance, when we talk about the cut to income taxes, the governor often touts that as a way to give money more to give people more money back in their pockets. It can be pretty nominal for some people, that income tax cut, but we did see the legislature pass an increase to the earned income tax credit, which is an income tax credit for low income earners. They doubled the percentage. Montana was at 10% of the federal earned income. It was at 20% now. Is that a fair
Yeah,
statement?
yeah, no, that's accurate. Yeah, the rhetoric the governor was using on his income tax cut pack. Well, I shouldn't say his income package, on the income tax package that passed, because it wasn't quite precisely what he proposed initially. There were some shenanigans in the middle. Was that it was a tax cut for everybody up and down the income spectrum. The state is increasing its match of the federal earned income tax credit, which is math so complicated I can't explain it on the in audio. It's a relatively small. It does benefit people that are low income working families. It's the intent of that policy is to encourage those folks to work. I think it might have initially come out of like 1990s era, like welfare reform type stuff. I could be wrong about that. Um, that is really relatively small in comparison. Like you look at the total cost, like of the tax cut package, right? The earned income tax piece of it is $10 or $20 million a year, and the overall cost of that, including rate cuts for high income earners who benefit a lot more because of the nature of the way income tax rates work, is the whole total cost again is 250 million a year ish, right? So it's small, relatively speaking, but it
Right.
will help. I mean, like money in pockets is money in pockets to some extent for folks.
Right,
So,
right. We want to take another question about a possible special session. What could trigger that? And this is pretty open ended to anyone who wants to hop in. We have talked about special session is likely if the feds decide to cut funding that the state uses. Federal funding makes up about 40% of the state budget, so it's going to feel like an earthquake if there are some big cuts. I will note that there was a provision in one bill. I believe that stayed in, Eric, in Lou Jones' trust bill, that encourages the governor to call a special session if there are big cuts to federal funding. Is that right?
yeah, I think the language was a little bit soft. It was we encourage the governor to call a special session if these things happen you can't manage around it, that sort of thing, which the governor would do anyway. Right? It's like the special sessions are called like if there are things that come up that can't wait until the next regular session, the next every other year session. And historically, it's often been like, oh, our budget is a mess and we need to fix it right now. We can't wait 6 months. We've got to fix it right now. Like the 2017 special session was the last one we had. Um, if the feds take action that, in contrast to what Mara was kind of mentioning earlier, right? If the feds take action on the budget that results in immediate, big, earth-shattering impacts to the federal budget, the question is like, when does that come? Does it come late enough in the 2 year cycle they're just going to wait until the 2027 session? And also, the state's been running pretty healthy surpluses the last 2 or 3 cycles, and one thing they've done is they've filled every single reserve account they have pretty much full to the brim. So there's a lot of money in reserve that could be moved around, some of it without the legislature coming back in order to try to manage around a potential crisis, whether that's feds cutting money or the economy crashing and the income tax collections that fund most of state government drying up.
Sure. I'm going to switch gears and tap Tom Ludi again. We have a question about bills that impact voting. So there were actually a lot of bills related to elections and voting, and it was another one of those topics where a lot of bills did not pass on voting in elections, but there were a few key voting bills that did pass. What would you say were most important?
Well, I think there were, a few. I mean, obviously, Mike Cuff had a bill that Senator Mike Cuff, from Eureka, had a bill that changed, how late you could register to vote. So, you no longer can register to vote the Monday before an election. You can vote until noon, or you register to vote until noon on election day. But I mean, if you put that in the context of what we've seen for the last several years, it's that you could register to vote if you were in line before polls closed at 8 o'clock. And so they were, basically the focus of that was to kind of get that registration, kind of curb that registration, and maybe, sort of cut back on those big lines that, in some cases, in Gallatin County, for example, I think they were lined up until like 4 in the morning. So, that was certainly one of the things. That one came in at the request of, elections officials, county elections officials around the state. I thought that one was rather interesting. They did, I think, and I was kind of surprised that it's taken so long. But you will be able to use a student ID to vote, right, as your voter ID, and for the first time. And I mean, if you think about how that's gone over the years, we recognized your concealed carry permit to, as legitimate ID to, to vote before we did student ID. So I thought that one was kind of interesting as well. And then of course we had a couple others that sort of spun off from things that we've seen in past elections. You might recall that, in the last election, there was an overcount of ballots in Butte, Montana, where they basically ran a batch through the machine twice. And that certainly got the attention of the legislature, and they sent a special committee out there to look that over. Senator Teresa Manzella, had a bill that, that she had cited that Butte incident as, sort of something where this might be applied, where she wanted, basically, hard copies of everybody's election results, delivered to the legislature, right? So they wanted those on hand, as well as, as reports from the Secretary of State, as well as, county level, analysis of how the vote went down. And that was interesting. Senator Wendy McCamey had a couple as well, one of which was to notify the public when absentee ballots begin counting. And I think that one's kind of interesting, because if you think about it, that count usually starts before 8 o'clock on election day. So that's interesting, right? I think that was a big change. And then some of the other ones were just kind of, perfunctory. I mean, there was another McCamey bill that basically had, standardized ballots, right? So everybody has ballots that are the same size, the same weight. They're recognizably marked as official ballots, and a lot of that gets back to, kind of assurances to voters, very specifically, conservative voters who have been very concerned about the integrity of elections.
Right. Certainly something they've been concerned about. And yeah, we'll see how those work in practice. Mara, we have a question for you about Medicaid reimbursement rate increases for OTs, PTs. How likely do you think it is the governor will sign off on those increases?
Oh, yeah, I think that's a very interesting one to watch. And it's an interesting example of lawmakers passing a lot of other bills that boosted Medicaid spending, or expanded Medicaid benefits, or did other things that kind of showed their endorsement of Medicaid as a functional part of Montana's healthcare system. So in this case, occupational therapists, physical therapists, and speech and language workers, if I recall correctly, they were part of this bill that would have increased provider rates specifically for them. They were not included in the provider rate increase that happened in 2023, which was really focused on behavioral health providers. And they came in this session in another bill sponsored by Representative Ed Buttrey, Republican from Great Falls, saying, like, look, we are one of the most conservative forms of healthcare that you could ask for. We help prevent much higher costs down the road. We help prevent surgeries. We help people recover from surgeries. And if you paid us more to treat Medicaid patients, this would be a net benefit for the state. It is an expensive bill, though. I think, if I recall correctly, I think it's about $6 million over one biennium. And for a specific group of providers, that's just a chunk of change. And if it wasn't Ed Buttrey bringing it, I would think that it had worse options. But Buttrey is known for being a pretty astute crafter of legislation, and when he takes his aim at something, he has a pretty good guess what's going to advance and not. So I think, to the question of the governor signing it, I think that the fact that it's so expensive, and the fact that many things in this budget are expensive, and the governor is expected to do some of those line item work, definitely makes it a possibility that this could be cut, or it could just be vetoed or not passed. But on the other hand, because of the Republican sponsor, and because of the general way that it might help decrease healthcare costs for Medicaid beneficiaries in other ways, I could see the governor being reluctantly in favor of it. He tends to be strategic about some of those things, and cost-benefit analysis as well.
Right, remains to be seen. Nora, I want to ask you a question, follow up something that we talked about, which was that Indigenous Peoples Day has been a debate that has come up several times over several sessions, carried by several different lawmakers. What was different about the debate this time and the bill that passed?
Yeah, supporters of this legislation through the years have taken different strategies. In the past, they sort of argued this was important for tribal sovereignty, or they talked about how it was meaningful to recognize people's identities and promote education. This year, the conversation was totally different, and instead it focused on inclusion and unity. So there was a lot of conversation about Indigenous Peoples Day is about recognizing Indigenous people from everywhere, and that includes people who are maybe have ancestors from Europe or something like that. And so you saw in the testimony a lot of non-Native people as well talking about their own ancestry, and that proved to be really successful. And when I talked to Shane Morigeau, a Democrat from Missoula who sponsored the bill, he said he thought that change in strategy was really responsible for the success, as well as sort of some of the divisions in the Senate. But it was really different from last session when Republican lawmakers really criticized Morigeau for talking about atrocities that Columbus committed against Native Americans. So I think that strategy was helpful.
Right. Okay, I want to ask a question, and anyone can chime in on this one, and I have some thoughts too. The question is, what was the role of the governor this legislative session, from his budget proposal, what he supported, when he put his finger on the scale, when he didn't? I think it's always really interesting to watch and see what happens in the foreground and what's likely happening in the background that we don't see, which is a lot. This governor, Governor Greg Gianforte, did have press conferences almost every week with reporters, and he would often say, I want lawmakers to pass my property tax bill. I want them to pass my income tax bill. I do not like this income tax proposal that they've proposed, or I don't like this property tax bill for XY reason. So he does put his finger on the scale. His budget is the first way he does that. That comes out before the legislative session starts. A lot of fiscal conservatives who think that Medicaid expansion costs too much say that because the governor put that proposal in his budget to begin with, that made its path, much easier and wide open when the session started. I will say, I think a lot of reporters have talked about that it was interesting. There seemed to be a lot of alignment between the bipartisan coalition that would sometimes vote together and pass key strategies. There seemed to be a lot of alignment with the governor, but that was not something that we would see outwardly. That was not something the governor really commented on. That was not something we heard lawmakers comment on, but they seemed to be in lockstep although it maybe wasn't so out in the open. But I'll throw that question out to anyone else.
Yeah, kind of to build on that. Yeah, I think I would agree that that was my perception of it. And one piece of evidence there, right, which is implicit in the way political things often are implicit, is that kind of probably the most visible member of that group in the Senate was Josh Kastmeyer out of Fort Benton, who of course beat Lola Sheldon Galloway, a former Republican lawmaker, the vice chair of the state GOP in a primary. I believe he was backed by the governor. Anyway, he was kind of when that group was getting up and saying things on the floor, oftentimes he was kind of the person speaking for that group. I also saw him carry a lot of water for the governor throughout the legislative process. He brought the governor's income tax bill, brought the governor's business equipment tax cut bill, a couple other measures that seemed to me like they were coming from the governor. And so, like, that's the evidence I have there, right? I put that together in a way that I hope it reflects reality, but that's really all I know about that relationship. So, Tom, you know more.
I think that. Well, I think when we say the governor, I do think that you have to sort of understand. I think it's better to sort of understand it in the terms of the executive branch, right? And sort of who's truly at the table. And so, is it his budget director who's at the table? More than likely so. But we certainly saw references to the governor. Eric and Mara certainly remember. When Senator Dan Emmerich, a Republican from Great Falls, looked toward the Democratic side of the floor and thanked them all for basically passing the governor's agenda. He was not very happy, Senator Emmerich, about that. But I think that's a good example. I think that was probably the impression that was there. But I do think that for the governor, really for any governor, it's kind of a light touch. And even when you were looking at the elections in 2024, where the governor was out there making some endorsements, those were made rather quietly. I think. I don't think it was necessarily as as loud as it could have been. So in that sense, I do think it's more subtle than people realize. I think a lot of times we say, it's that guy over there, and it's more subtle. It's a team. It's a team that represents the governor that kind of moves these things along and was active throughout the session, for sure.
One thing I'll note to add on to that as well, if you think about Gianforte's presence in the legislature in 2021, right after he got elected, it was pretty frazzled, I think. There was a lot of appointments going on. He was trying to get his executive branch in order. He was trying to get people in those department positions that he trusted and that he could use as delegates. It was a little scattered. I'm sure that he got things done that he was proud of, but it was tough. Last session, it was kind of an 11th hour approach where the governor vetoed a lot of things or returned things with line item vetoes and amendatory vetoes very late in the process, and kind of snubbed a lot of the Republican lawmakers who sent him things. And his response, whether it was on a CPS bill or something else, was just, I actually don't think this is good policy, and I'm going to throw this back to you covered in red ink. And this session, it seems like he got out in front of that by getting involved in the Republican primary. He said explicitly that he wanted legislative partners to return to Helena in 2025 that he could work with. And like other movers and shakers in the lobbying scene, the governor tried to craft a block of lawmakers that he could sit down and truly negotiate interesting policy with. So he has evolved a lot in his relationship with the legislature over these last 3 sessions.
Well, and not that anyone wants to start thinking about next legislative session, but it will be Governor Greg Gianforte's last. He will be terming out as governor, and I think that'll be super, super interesting to watch how that session unfolds. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I think we could probably keep talking about this for a while longer, but we're gonna cut ourselves off for now. But I do want to tell people who tuned in, thank you so much for having this conversation with us. We want to keep hearing from you. Get in touch with reporters that you have questions for. Let them know if you have stories you think they should be looking into or questions you want answered. We want to hear from you. So Google us. You will find us. we want to talk to you. And this has been the session, a look at the policy and politics inside the Montana State House. Thank you so much to Montana Public Radio, Montana Free Press, and Yellowstone Public Radio, the three organizations that make this podcast possible and this event. Thank you in particular, and a huge shout out to Nick Mott, our producer, our editors, Corin Cates Carney, Jackie Coffin, and Holly Michaels. Really, really, really couldn't do it without you. Thank you also to Nate Schoenfelder and Josh Burnham for putting this production on, for getting the word out about our podcast, for getting it online and making it digestible and easy to read and engaged. So there are so many people who work on this, and it's been so fun to put it together every week. We usually talk about like our favorite moment. Excuse me. Our favorite moment every week. For me, it's always the session. Getting choked up about it. No, I'm so glad the session's over. Anyways, thank you all to the reporters for being here tonight. We so appreciate you sharing your reporting and your expertise. And thanks to all of you for your great questions and for being a part of this with us. This is why we do what we do. So thanks so much for tuning in. That's it for now.